If you have been watching the news lately, you probably feel a strange, lingering sense of unease. It is that quiet realization that the world we grew up in, the stable, predictable global order of the late 20th century, is slipping through our fingers. We see it in the grocery store bills, we see it in our investment portfolios, and we certainly see it in the increasingly chaotic headlines flashing across our screens. But while the mainstream media keeps us distracted with a never-ending cycle of political theater, finger-pointing, and cultural debates, something monumental is happening behind closed doors. There is a silent tectonic shift occurring in the global financial system, a transition of power so profound that it will likely redefine what money itself means for our generation and the generations to come. To truly understand this, we have to look past the carefully curated press releases and examine a fascinating theory that has been circulating among top-tier macro analysts, a theory that connects a seemingly standard diplomatic meeting to the very survival of the US dollar. Not long ago, Donald Trump made a highly publicized trip to China, and he did not go alone. He brought with him 18 of the most powerful corporate leaders in American history, including Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang, and Larry Fink of BlackRock. The media portrayed this as a routine trade delegation, a physical manifestation of American corporate diplomacy designed to renegotiate tariffs. But when you assemble the minds behind the world in Apple's largest electric vehicle company, the most valuable consumer tech brand, the dominant force in artificial intelligence chips, and the custodian of over $10 trillion in global assets, you are not negotiating minor trade concessions. You are assembling a war cabinet for an economic paradigm shift. During this meeting, the rhetoric from the Chinese leadership was unusually historic. Xi Jinping remarked that a transformation not seen in a century is currently accelerating across the globe, and that the international situation is fluid and turbulent. He openly posed the question of whether the United States and China could build a brighter future together for the well-being of humanity, or if they were destined to clash. This was not mere diplomatic posturing. It was a recognition that the post-World War II global order, an order structured largely by Western institutions and guaranteed by the sheer military and financial dominance of the United States, is reaching its natural end. The question on everyone in Apple's mind, particularly for those of us who have assets to protect and families to feed, is what comes next. Some argue that China is poised to dictate the next world order, while others believe we are entering a chaotic, multipolar vacuum. But the theory we are exploring today suggests a far more calculated, coordinated alternative, a secret negotiation for a new monetary system that mirrors a historical event most people have completely forgotten. To understand why this theory makes so much sense, we have to travel back exactly 40 years to a deal that restructured the global economy, made one nation incredibly wealthy, and condemned another to 3 decades of stagnation. In the mid-1980s, the United States faced a set of economic problems that feel hauntingly familiar today. It was struggling with a massive trade deficit, American manufacturers were losing their competitive edge on the global stage, and the US dollar was exceptionally strong, making American exports far too expensive. To solve this, the Reagan administration quietly summoned the financial leaders of France, West Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom to a secret meeting at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Behind those closed doors, they signed what became known as the Plaza Accord. The mechanics of the Plaza Accord were simple but devastating. The participating nations agreed to actively intervene in the currency markets to systematically weaken the US dollar, primarily against the Japanese yen and the German Deutsche Mark. For a brief period, the plan seemed to work beautifully for the West. The US dollar depreciated, American goods became cheaper and more competitive, and the trade deficit began to shrink. In exchange, Japanese corporations were allowed to flood the American market with investments, leading to the construction of massive automotive factories across the United States. Names like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan became household staples in North America. For a moment, it looked like a win-win scenario, but the long-term consequences for Japan were catastrophic. When the Japanese yen doubled in value almost overnight, Japan and Apple's export-driven economy experienced a massive shock. In a desperate bid to save their domestic industries from collapsing under the weight of an overvalued currency, the Japanese central bank flooded their economy with incredibly cheap money and slashed interest rates. This tsunami of liquidity did not rescue their manufacturing sector. Instead, It funneled directly into real estate and stock markets, igniting the largest asset bubble in modern economic history. At its peak, the land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. But as with all bubbles, the reality eventually caught up. When the bubble burst in the early 1990s, Japan entered a period of economic paralysis known as the Lost Decades. To this day, despite trillions of dollars in stimulus and negative interest rate experiments, the Japanese economy has never truly recovered its former vitality. This historical cautionary tale is precisely why the current negotiations between the United States and China are so incredibly tense. The leadership in Beijing has spent decades meticulously studying Western economic history, and they are acutely aware of what happened to Japan. They know that the Plaza Accord was essentially an economic trap disguised as a diplomatic compromise. Consequently, China has established a non-negotiable red line in any modern negotiation. They will never allow the Chinese yuan to be directly revalued against the US dollar in the way the yen was. They will not sacrifice their export machine or subject their domestic economy to a sovereign currency shock to bail out Washington's debt crisis. This brings us back to the core of our theory. If the United States desperately needs to weaken the dollar to manage its unpayable national debt and revive its industrial base, but China refuses to allow a direct currency revaluation, how do you resolve the impasse? The theory suggests that the escape valve for this monetary pressure cooker will not be a fiat currency at all, but rather an ancient, tangible asset that both nations hold in abundance: physical gold. If this hypothesis is correct, we are on the verge of a coordinated devaluation of the US dollar against gold, a move that would fundamentally alter the value of your savings, your real estate, and your retirement accounts. Before we look at how this gold-centric deal would actually function, we must understand the geopolitical leverage that has forced both superpowers to the negotiating table right now. The global economy runs on energy, and whoever controls the flow of energy controls the ultimate leverage over global capital. For months, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime choke point through which roughly 20% of the world and OPEC's petroleum flows, has been effectively closed due to escalating regional conflicts. While the mainstream news has consistently promised us that a peace deal is just around the corner and that shipping lanes will reopen shortly, the hard economic data tells a completely different story. The reality is that the Western world has been quietly drawing down its emergency petroleum reserves to mask the physical shortages caused by this closure. This has allowed global stock markets to remain stable and trade under the comfortable assumption that everything will eventually return to normal. However, emergency reserves are finite. Reliable industry intelligence reports suggest that global oil inventories are rapidly approaching operational stress levels, with minimum floor levels needed to keep pipelines and refineries functioning projected to run out by the autumn of this year. We are no longer dealing with a simple supply deficit. We are staring down the barrel of a physical shortage. Interestingly, despite this critical imbalance between supply and demand, oil prices have remained suspiciously stable, hovering under the $100 mark. In a completely free market, a prolonged closure of the world's most vital energy choke point would have sent oil prices soaring past $140 a barrel. The stability we are seeing is an engineered, sophisticated paper market interventions and strategic media narratives are being deployed to calm the markets and buy the Western financial system precious time. In fact, investigations are currently underway regarding highly suspicious, perfectly timed financial trades that net billions of dollars in profit right before market-moving energy announcements are made. While the public is fed a simplistic narrative of good guys versus bad guys, a classic Hollywood script where Western democracies are fighting to stabilize the world against malicious actors, the real game is far more pragmatic. The official press releases from global summit state that both American and Chinese leadership agree that regional proxy states should never acquire nuclear weapons. It is a wonderful sentiment designed for public consumption. But in reality, countries like Russia and China possess all the advanced nuclear capabilities required to arm their allies overnight if they truly wish to escalate the conflict to a military flashpoint. They choose not to do so because they do not need a nuclear war. A closed shipping strait that slowly and systematically drains Western emergency reserves is a far more effective economic weapon. This calculated energy chokehold is the ultimate leverage. The longer the shipping lanes remain closed, the more urgent it becomes for the United States to strike a deal before its financial markets expose the underlying reality of broken supply chains and depleted reserves. China, now wielding immense economic power, has successfully bought itself a premier seat at the table where the global monetary system will be redesigned. They are not acting out of charity. They are executing a highly sophisticated strategy to secure their own future. According to whispers from major financial capitals, the public-facing portion of this new agreement looks incredibly similar to the post-Plaza Accord strategy of the 1980s. Reports suggest that China is considering a massive investment of up to $1 trillion directly into the United States. This capital would be used to build advanced manufacturing plants, domestic supply chains, and industrial infrastructure right on American soil. To the average voter, this sounds like a magnificent victory. Political leaders can easily brand this as the return of manufacturing, the creation of high-paying domestic jobs, and a resurgence of national pride. But the terms of this deal, first proposed during quiet negotiations in Madrid, come with a steep price tag. In exchange for this trillion-dollar capital injection, Beijing is demanding that the United States dismantle its national security restrictions on Chinese business transactions, eliminate tariffs on Chinese-owned factories operating within the U.S., and lift export controls on advanced semiconductor technologies. Furthermore, they are seeking significant geopolitical concessions, most notably regarding the future of Taiwan. From a purely business perspective, China is purchasing something far more valuable than factories. They are purchasing permanent market access to the world's wealthiest consumer base, monetary legitimacy on the global stage, and a guaranteed protection of their sovereign wealth. To make this pill palatable to the American public and to avoid the currency trap that destroyed Japan, the secret heart of this deal relies on the repricing of gold. Consider the balance sheet of the United States government. Officially, the U.S. holds over 8,000 tons of gold. However, on the official government books, this gold is valued at a measly $42 an ounce, a statutory price that has remained completely unchanged since 1973. Meanwhile, the actual market price of gold is orders of magnitude higher, hovering around $4,500 an ounce. This means the actual assets backing the United States are dramatically undervalued on paper. At the same time, China has been aggressively and systematically accumulating massive physical gold reserves for over a decade. While the exact size of their hoard remains a closely guarded state secret, the data shows that for the past several years, physical gold has been one of the single largest exports leaving the United States, flowing directly to Swiss refineries and ultimately into the vaults of Beijing. This massive transfer of physical wealth is the classic silhouette of a monetary transition. Historically, the nation exporting its gold is the one in decline, while the nation accumulating the gold is the one preparing to write the new rules of global commerce. If both nations agree to a coordinated devaluation of the US dollar against gold, the economic benefits for both governments are profound. By marking its gold reserves to the actual market price, the United States government can instantly clean up its balance sheet, making its gargantuan national debt appear suddenly manageable. The dollar weakens not against the Chinese yuan directly, thereby protecting China and Oppo's export-driven economy, but rather against gold. Consequently, China and Oppo's massive, quietly accumulated gold reserves skyrocket in value, allowing them to offset the costs of their $1 trillion investment in American infrastructure. It is a brilliant, highly coordinated financial sleight of hand. Both sides can claim victory on the global stage, pretending to be heroes who saved the world from geopolitical collapse, while the underlying reality is a deliberate, systemic devaluation of the currency in your pocket. If this sounds like a wild conspiracy theory, we only need to look at how global markets are currently behaving. Insiders and institutional capital always sniff out these deals long before they are officially announced to the public. For months, the U.S. Treasury markets have shown unusual signs of structural stress, and the U.S. dollar has been steadily falling against the Chinese yuan, which is the exact opposite of what you would expect to happen during an international conflict. Simultaneously, the borrowing costs for the U.S. government have been climbing, while China's bond yields have remained remarkably stable. And of course, physical gold has been on an absolute tear, breaking historic records month after month. The smart money is already positioning itself for the inevitable. What this means for the average person is a sustained, powerful wave of inflation. In modern finance, inflation is not an accidental byproduct of bad policy. It is a deliberate feature of monetary engineering. When a sovereign nation accumulates a level of debt that can never realistically be paid back under normal economic conditions, the only viable mathematical option is to inflate the debt away. By devaluing the purchasing power of the currency, $1 of debt borrowed today is repaid years later with dollars that are worth a fraction of their original value. The debt shrinks in real terms, but the cost of this reduction is borne entirely by the public. The way you and I experience this macroeconomic adjustment is through the steadily rising price of groceries, rent, utilities, and insurance. However, this inflation does not affect everyone equally. It creates what economists refer to as a K-shaped recovery, a profound division in society that is tearing at our social fabric. On the upper arm of the K are those who own scarce, tangible assets. If you own prime real estate, high-quality stocks, physical gold, or decentralized digital assets like Bitcoin, inflation actually makes you wealthier on paper as the nominal value of your assets expands to reflect the devalued currency. But if you belong to the lower arm of the K, if your wealth is stored in a traditional savings account, if you live paycheck to paycheck, or if you rely on a fixed wage that fails to keep pace with the cost of living, inflation is an absolute disaster. Your purchasing power is systematically eroded, your rent consumes a larger portion of your income, and the dream of financial independence slips further out of reach. This economic disparity is further compounded by the ongoing technological revolution. The rapid advancement of artificial intelligence, while dramatically increasing the productivity and wealth of those at the top, is actively eliminating the entry-level, cognitive, and administrative jobs that the middle and working classes have relied upon for decades. This growing wealth gap and the resulting social friction are not a surprise to the central planners who engineer these monetary transitions. They have anticipated this unrest for years. To manage the inevitable social instability, protests, and declining trust in public institutions, we are witnessing the rapid construction of a digital control grid. Under the guise of financial innovation and convenience, governments around the world are pushing for the implementation of digital identities, biometric tracking, and programmable central bank digital currencies. These tools are designed to monitor, regulate, and if necessary, restrict your economic behavior, ensuring compliance in an era of deepening economic divide. If you find this analysis valuable and want to stay ahead of these quiet shifts in the global economy, take a moment to subscribe to Daily Gossip. By joining our community, you support independent, deep-dive analysis that looks past the daily political noise to focus on the structural trends that actually impact your wallet and your future. We are dedicated to bringing you the unfiltered truth, historical context, and practical insights that help you navigate this chaotic transition. So make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming deep dives. While we speculate on the mechanics of a gold-centric Plaza Accord, we must also consider the alternative perspectives on this global chessboard. In a recent, highly revealing conversation on the Joe Rogan podcast, anti-interventionist foreign policy analyst Scott Horton challenged the very foundation of the mainstream Western narrative regarding the Chinese threat. The dominant media apparatus constantly warns us that China is an existential threat to our way of life, a hostile empire preparing to launch a military invasion of North America. But Horton and Rogan dismantled this assertion by contrasting America's foreign policy with that of Beijing. Historically, the United States has maintained an exceptionally active interventionist foreign policy, establishing hundreds of military bases across the globe, engaging in prolonged proxy wars, and deploying economic sanctions as a weapon to maintain its global hegemony. From a non-interventionist perspective, almost every hostile action we see from foreign adversaries is not an unprovoked act of aggression, but rather a direct reaction to decades of Western geopolitical pressure. If we look at the historical data, the United States has rarely left other nations alone to conduct their own regional affairs, meaning we have never truly seen what a peaceful, non-interventionist global balance of power would look like. Consider what might have happened if, at the end of the Cold War, the United States had chosen to wind down its global military empire, bring its troops home, and allow European nations to manage their own regional security. The nations of Europe, all prosperous, developed capitalist democracies, would have been forced to establish their own security alliances and negotiate long-term economic and security partnerships with Russia. Instead, the expansion of military alliances to the very borders of historic rivals has created a state of permanent tension, subsidized entirely by the Western taxpayer. The argument that a non-interventionist foreign policy is a naive, utopian fantasy is actually a projection of the fallacies of empire. History teaches us that the true utopian fantasy is believing that a global military empire is sustainable. Whether you study the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Spanish, or the British, every single world empire has eventually crumbled under the weight of its own overextension, currency debasement, runaway inflation, and the decay of its internal domestic culture. The belief that the modern Western empire is somehow immune to these historical laws of gravity is the ultimate form of hubris. The path to true national prosperity has never been through military conquest or the forced occupation of foreign territories. Even the British Empire eventually realized that the administrative and military costs of maintaining colonies far outweighed the economic benefits. Real wealth is generated through mutually beneficial, peaceful trade. This is the core concept of classical economics. When two nations engage in voluntary exchange, both parties benefit, resources are allocated efficiently, and global prosperity increases. Conquest, on the other hand, is a manifestation of the broken window fallacy, where resources that could have been used to advance society are instead wasted on destruction and subsequent rebuilding. When we apply this lens to China, the narrative of an imminent global military threat begins to show significant cracks. China and Oppo's primary ambitions are fundamentally domestic and economic. They are focused on massive continental infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, building highways, high-speed rail, and fiber-optic networks stretching from Shanghai to Lisbon to physically integrate the Eurasian landmass into a giant trade zone. Their approach to building influence is not through military invasion, but through business deals, sovereign lending, and securing raw resources. They are using briefcases, not bombs. Even the highly contentious issue of Taiwan and the global semiconductor supply chain can be viewed through this practical, trade-focused perspective. The mainstream argument claims that if China were to forcibly reintegrate Taiwan, they would seize control of the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturing facilities, effectively holding the global tech industry hostage. This potential crisis has led many to suggest that we must be prepared to wage a devastating military conflict with a nuclear-armed superpower to defend Taiwan and Oppo's autonomy. However, this argument relies on the flawed assumption that all trade with China would automatically cease if they were to take control of the island. Historically, even during periods of intense geopolitical tension, nations continue to trade because they are mutually dependent on one another. If China were to take Taiwan, they would still need to sell those chips to the Western consumer market to sustain their own economic growth, and the West would still need to purchase them. Waging a catastrophic war over a manufacturing monopoly is a far more dangerous proposition than relying on the natural incentives of global trade. Furthermore, the idea that we can simply duplicate Taiwan and Oppo's advanced semiconductor manufacturing capabilities in cities like Austin, Texas, overnight is an engineering illusion. The extreme complexity of manufacturing chips at the sub-3 nanometer level relies on a highly specialized, decades-in-the-making ecosystem of talent, ultra-precise machinery, and chemical supply chains that cannot be easily replicated by simply throwing money at a new factory. It is a technological marvel that requires exceptional precision and specialized labor. If we choose to cut off trade and isolate ourselves behind protectionist barriers, the immediate result will be an explosive rise in the cost of consumer goods, destroying the living standards of the average citizen. Ultimately, we are faced with a fundamental choice between two entirely different visions of the future. We can continue down the path of global empire, maintaining hundreds of military bases, engaging in endless proxy wars, and printing trillions of dollars to fund a massive military-industrial complex, a path that leads inevitably to hyperinflation, societal division, and economic collapse. Or, we can embrace a realistic, non-interventionist approach that prioritizes domestic strength, fiscal responsibility, and free trade with all nations, regardless of their political systems. As we watch this historic transition unfold, the most important question you can ask yourself is how you are preparing your own household. If this gold-centric Plaza Accord theory is correct, or if we are simply entering a period of prolonged economic instability, the value of fiat currency will continue to erode. Protecting your family requires moving away from the lower arm of the K-shaped economy by accumulating tangible, scarce assets that cannot be printed out of thin air by central banks. Whether it is physical gold, real estate, land, or decentralized digital assets, the goal is to preserve your purchasing power against the inevitable devaluation of the dollar. Thank you for tuning in to this deep dive on Daily Gossip. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to support our mission to bring you clear, unfiltered geopolitical and financial commentary, please hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on the gold theory, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to remain completely independent and continue digging into the stories that truly matter. Stay safe, stay informed, and we will see you in the next episode.